Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar on maximizing file storage efficiency in Microsoft 365, featuring one of my most amazing friends from the MVP community, Drew Madelung. Let me first start by introducing myself. My name is Vlad Ketvinescu. I'm a Microsoft MVP from Montreal, Canada, and a technical evangelist at Syskit. For those of you that never heard about Syskit before, Syskit is a Microsoft 365 or SharePoint company founded more than 14 years ago. We have 4 products around SharePoint on-prem and Microsoft 365 governance, and over 3,500 customers around the world, ranging from anywhere from small businesses to large corporations. Now, before we start, a few housekeeping items. You will receive a recording of today's webinar. So if ever you have to step out for something, you have another meeting coming up, you will get the recording from the webinar. So do not worry about that. And it might take 1 or 2 days until you get it. So don't worry if you do not get it today. After the presentation, we will also have a short demo of SysKit, which will show you how you can do your storage management a lot easier. Of course, Drew is going to cover all the ways you can do it out of the box with Microsoft's option. And at the end, we will take just a few minutes to show you how much easier it can be with Syskit. And of course, at the end, we will have a Q&A session. So please do not let Drew do a monologue the whole time. Anything you see on the screen that you might have a question on, do not hesitate to put it in the question box. This way, we will make sure we get to all the questions before we end the webinar. Now, enough of me. It's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Drew Madelung. Now, I've known Drew for 10 years now. Drew is a Microsoft MVP, started off SharePoint on-prem like me, now does all of Microsoft 365, and he works at an amazing consulting company called Protiviti. I know Drew has an official bio, but I want to say anything you want to know about Microsoft 365, ask Drew. Drew is my go-to person for anything nowadays, especially information protection and Microsoft 365 administration, and also he's a good golf teacher. That's something that not many people know about Drew. I like to say he's a semi-professional golfer. So if you ever need help on your swing or anything, don't hesitate to ask him. And Drew, you've been an MVP for 10 years now, like me, right? I think we both started at the same time, almost 10 years.
Yeah, I think you got a year and a half on me, Vlad. So
okay, so this July, you'll get your blue disc.
It's coming.
It's coming. But Drew, are you ready to take it over?
I am. So thank you for that, Vlad. I just want to confirm, Vlad, you can see my screen. Everything looks good?
Yes, I can. Everything looks awesome.
Awesome. So thank you for that. And so we'll be talking today all about storage. And I could talk about golf, but we'll save that for another host here this time, or another webinar here, Vlad. But today, those are gonna be all about storage. So I think a nice intro for this would be, Vlad and I also put together a webinar series with Syskit here, our friends here, and we did do a very short session around storage in one of our video series. This is gonna go much, much, much deeper. So I will touch on some of the main points we talked about in that, but I'm gonna go much deeper into the optimization and the governance that I've worked with different organizations in supporting potentially very large scenarios I've worked with for a ton of data, and how to maximize that. Like, what can you do for ensuring you don't hit some of those limits? Or if you do, what can you do to continue to manage that in my opinion, the best practice way? So Vlad did introduce me. The work I am at, I've been consulting for a long time, focused on M365. My world is around usually large organizations, and really dialed into some of the more complex situations for global organizations, which deals with some very complex scenarios for multi-geo, for some compliance and regulatory controls, which data is a part of that, right? So as we have more data being managed, more expectations for compliance, those lead to more data being stored. I am on a mini mission to get rid of digital hoarding, which includes storage management, right? It includes a starting point where customers say, or organizations say, I retain everything, I keep everything. And then they come back in a year and say, well, my tenant's full. And I'm like, well, it's because you kept everything. So there's strategies we can talk about to minimize that. And I'll talk a little bit more about the risks of even keeping storage like that for that long. So the agenda I'm going to be going through, first, I need to set the stage for how file storage is set up in 365. That's very key to understanding the impacts across different services. I'll go into all the reporting and managing that you can see, as Vlad mentioned, in Microsoft 365 and some of the limitations that they have there. And then the last two are really going on to optimizing and ongoing. Okay, so where are you at today? What can we do today, short term? And then what are some of the ideas you can take long term to ensure if you are worried about becoming full or worried about having kind of general storage management? I'll talk about some ideas that we can take with you to make that better. But we need to start with how file storage works. And you need to first understand that your storage that you have is based on the licensing that you get. Okay? So the storage you have, let's say if I have 1,000 users or I have 10,000 users, the licensing, it doesn't matter how many users, it's actually based on licensing. And the license you purchase is for your entire tenant. So you're buying it, so if you're in a multi-tenant environment, you're actually buying licensing based on the licensing you have in that tenant itself. Now, the storage platform for Microsoft 365 is SharePoint Online. This has not changed. This is the world of SharePoint has evolved. If you remember, probably would have been 2016, 2017. I remember when that kind of time period was, when SharePoint went away for a second. You just had sites in the corner. What that means is that SharePoint has been the back end the entire time. Whether it's called SharePoint, whether it's called sites, SharePoint is the file storage across Microsoft 365, across the workloads. Right, so I'll talk more about the different solutions and how they interact. But SharePoint Online, when you're thinking about storage management, you are focusing in on SharePoint Online storage management, which falls then into managing storage across other solutions. The other key storage solution you have that is similar but not directly related to from a licensing perspective is OneDrive. So every time you create a SharePoint site, every time you create a Microsoft team, you're going to get a SharePoint site. A site collection, I need to make sure I say that. So site collection is your storage repository. OneDrive, every OneDrive you have, so if you have 5,000 employees, you have 5,000 site collections. That data, that storage, does not against your quota for your overall tenant storage. So if you have 1 terabyte of file storage in your tenant and you have 50 SharePoint sites, they will count towards your quota. OneDrive, and if you have 1,000 OneDrive sites, none of the data in those OneDrive sites counts against your 1 terabyte quota in your organization. Now, what that you need to be careful of is does not mean that OneDrive is a file share. I have had customers say, well, can I migrate to minimize storage control? Can I migrate my file shares into like service account based OneDrives? And that is not allowed. That's technically not allowed from a licensing perspective. A OneDrive licensing to have this is a human-centric account. So you cannot the goal is not to migrate file shares or utilize OneDrive to minimize your SharePoint usage. That's not the way to govern your organization. If that's happening, you need to shift away from that. It is not allowed to have non-human centric accounts in OneDrive. And so you can't, I've actually had customers say, can I just migrate my T drive into a OneDrive called T drive? The answer is no, that's not allowed. So that does lead to challenges in organizing your storage, which is why we're talking about this today. So if you do run out, if you do think you're kind of at the edge, I want to make sure I don't scare everyone by saying you can always go more. A lot of organizations I work with, you have to end up buying more storage depending on use cases. We can always buy more, but we want to talk about optimization before you jump into purchasing. So the way to think about this file storage structure is SharePoint is in the middle. And as you look at the different functions where files are stored in Microsoft 365, you can have a comm site that's obviously in SharePoint. Every Microsoft team, the Files tab in Microsoft Team is a SharePoint Online site collection. Every OneDrive for Business is a SharePoint Online site collection. Every time you create a modern SharePoint team site or classic team site, it is still pointed in SharePoint Online. Viva Engage Communities, the Files tab for that, all hosted in SharePoint Online. And one of the new functionalities inside of SharePoint Embedded, which actually is where Loop is stored, those are also stored in SharePoint Online. So if you start to build custom apps in SharePoint Embedded or purchase solutions that use Embedded, that also counts inside of SharePoint Online. So what that means is SharePoint Online is where we're looking at governing. And in this scenario, the only thing that doesn't count against your quota is OneDrive for Business down there in the bottom. Now there are still limitations. Okay, so let's look. We have in SharePoint Online, you have SharePoint Online technical limitations that you need to be aware of. The main one we look at is 25 terabytes per site collection. So that can be your Microsoft team. That can be technically a Viva Engage community. If you maybe have some incredibly large videos, it can be your SharePoint communication site. So that 25 terabyte is actually the one that will become most prevalent, which is if you have very large sites, 25 terabytes will be your max you can even put on that site. You can only have 2 million sites in your organization. So I personally haven't seen an organization get nearly close to that. If you're one of them, just send me a screenshot of it. I'd love to see the admin center with like 2 million, like 1.8 million sites or something, but that's a lot of data. But you do have a limit for file size. It used to be a lot smaller. Thankfully, that's been continuously raised, 250 gigs. I've tried to build some files at large to upload them against it. It works fine. But to be aware of that is if you're doing a migration, potentially in some very large video files, I've seen those come into play of limitations that you would have, that if you think about large file sizes, those are going to be your top culprits for usage. If you don't know it, you can still attach things to list items. And those list item data also attaches to your storage solution. So I have had a scenario where an organization was using, this started in on-prem but wanted to go online, where they had a job that ran for years and years and years, and it was updating list items, and it would just put stuff in a list item and then attach a service ticket to it. And it was kind of stored as a record. That had millions of line items in that. And when you looked at it from a storage perspective, that list looked, it's got a lot of data, but actually every file attachment to that list item was also part of your storage quota. So their on-prem migration was pretty hefty because we had, for that database, because we had to have a very, very large site collection to bring that over into, and kind of decoupling that. So really understanding though, even if you attach something somewhere, it's going to be counting against your storage in 365. So some of the key impacts that are more recent, I'll say, that will affect your quota more. The first one is going to be around Teams meetings. So this is not new, but 3 or 4 years ago, we had the shift to Modern Stream and to Teams recordings being held into SharePoint and OneDrive. So if you have non-channel meetings, so if I have a regular Teams meeting, that's going to go into OneDrive, which at that point, right, doesn't count against your quota. But I'll talk about your site quotas, doesn't count against your storage quota. So you still can start to fill up OneDrive very heavily with videos based on Teams meetings. And if you're having the channels, you'll be having all of that data held in the SharePoint site. So what I've seen here is a large impact for data can be if you have all of these meetings recordings, and I'm starting to see the proliferation of that more with Copilot, right? You don't have to do recordings, but it's been a common practice I see to turn on recordings and transcriptions, which is starting to see for me, a rise in storage usage. I'll talk more about the expiration, but we can do solutions to expire Teams meetings specifically. Coming through, it'll be interesting to see how this grows, but right now SharePoint embedded, if you create Microsoft Loop, loops, I forget if you go to the workspace and you create the loop elements in there, those are actually all stored back in SharePoint. Now, what I've looked at, those have been very small amounts of data today, but as SharePoint embedded continues to grow, these will be impacts that you need to be aware of to monitor, and it's not hard, those are a little harder to get to monitor that level of data of usage. So if you look at some of the launch partners for embedded, there will be custom apps that use embedded that you need to be aware of how those impact you, because they don't come out in your standard SharePoint reports. Next huge one is preservation, hold, and recycle bin. So retention will keep a lot of things, and I have a lot of conversation on retention at the end here, but there is a library in your organization. If you are retaining information, there is actually a library on each site collection called the preservation hold library, that if you have, let's say, a retention policy, I want to keep everything for 3 years, and I go delete it, it will go into that preservation hold library and still count against your storage quota, your overall file storage. So that data always counts, and same thing with recycle bin. So recycle bin is important. If you've seen people do like a cleanup and they're like, my site's empty now. It's like, well, it's not. You actually still have to go into the recycle bin and remove that information there if you start to hit some of the quotas specifically in your site. And the last one is versioning. So on-prem, if you come from the on-prem world, administration versioning has been interesting. In moving to the cloud fully, where we now have the full autosave functionality. The default version now is over 500, but the way versioning works has not evolved. Let's say it still only checks deltas, but it still holds a large amount of information. That's very hard to report on. So if you have some libraries that have some very large files that have a ton of autosave functionality, I've seen this with very large Excel files, it will start to build, and you have 500 version limit on that, it will start to build a very large usage for all of those versions as it continues to grow. And that's one where reporting and awareness of that is very vital. So you look at it and say, why is my site so full? It's most likely going to be versions and some very large files hanging out there. The other impact I've seen with versioning is in doing different migrations. People underestimate the version impact as that data comes over. They'll work with organizations. They want to keep all my versioning. I'll say, are you sure? Do you really need that? And you'll see really a larger uptick of that information based on all those versions coming over. So you might see, especially if you're coming from on-prem, if you see kind of your basic storage, it will, what I've seen is, I don't have a percentage, but it's going to be a little bit larger. I always say, like, throw an extra 5 to 10% of what your expectation is. So if you're really close to that number, like for total storage quota, be very aware that if you're doing a migration, it adds some wiggle room there to handle that. So how can I know how much data I actually have? If I go into my tenant and I look at the storage, what do I actually get? So the details of it is, you get 1 terabyte, as it kind of said at the beginning, you get 1 terabyte to start, and then you get 10 gigs for every user, every license user that you have, except F licensing, so your frontline worker licensing. So if I had 1,000 users, you have 10 terabytes. That's the best way to look at it. And you can kind of go up and down from there. So that's how you'll know how much information you actually have, or how much data you're allowed to store in SharePoint. Additional SharePoint storage can get very pricey. Okay, so you're looking at 20 cents per gig. That's the list price. You have, so 1 terabyte is $200 a month. If you look at some of the, look at some of the data in your organization and the exponential growth, it is some of the data numbers that are shared are crazy for the amount of information that's actually migrated and working live in Microsoft 365. So this can get very costly if you don't manage it and have a plan to say, like, just kind of assume that we can just keep buying more. Depending on your very organizational specific, but that is a much higher cost than some of the ramifications if you do not, or better scenarios if you do clean up. So there are options for reporting, right? We need to know how much information we have, what we're doing. So the first thing to look at is going to be in our SharePoint Admin Center. That's going to be the first place we look at. And in my opinion, they make it a little small. They don't really have a good spot for it, so they stick it up in the top right, and it still looks very small for what's potentially very important. And so Active Admin Center, be a SharePoint admin, go to the Active Sites tab, it's in the top right. That's where you go look at your quota that you have in your organization. That's how much data you can use. You can see as you dive more into it, so as you kind of go deeper into per site, there is ability to go look at this all per site, obviously. One thing to note, there is a view on automatic inactive sites called largest sites. So as you start to monitor and investigate what's going on, you can go look at all of the biggest sites in your organization, and you'll see they all fall under the overall quota you have here. So in this tenant I have is 2 terabytes, and I can sort by large sites, and I'll show you that to see the amount of information actually used here. One thing to know about active sites, this is not showing your OneDrive sites. So from a visually, if you're going to be managing OneDrive, we're going to be managing that in PowerShell. I'm going to have a UI against the overall usage. You don't have a UI that can total count. You're going to be going into PowerShell to manipulate anything you're looking at from, in my opinion, anything I would go to for working with OneDrive. Again, that doesn't count against your quota, but important to know if you're looking at what are top, if I want to manage some of the per OneDrive scenarios. The other area to look at in the SharePoint admin portal, if you don't go to active sites, is there is actually a card. So right on the SharePoint admin landing page, usually you have to scroll down. I know a lot of people don't even know this exists. So there is a SharePoint storage usage, little card that takes that information you had in the top right and gives you more of a visual indicator with a risk bar. So obviously in this demo tenant, there's very little percentage used, but you can use this to start to track your usage better than just looking at the bar in the top right, because this will actually give you like a chart. So if you start to see your data continuously growing, you could give yourself an idea of, okay, over the last 3 months, I've gained 10%, I average 10% over the next 3 months, when will my storage be full? And this gives you a better visual indicator for it, but there's not a good way to report on this. It's just a single card in the admin portal that most people don't know exists. So good way to look at it, but not a great way to kind of manage it going forward. To go deep, there are storage reports for this too. So as you go outside of the SharePoint Admin Center, you can navigate to it, but in the Admin Center, there's a usage report. In the SharePoint usage report, there is a storage section. So this will also give you the total amount of storage that you have. But it doesn't tell you like what site it is or what your actual quota is, just simply how much storage is actually being used in my organization. So informational, but not necessarily actionable. And that's the same with OneDrive. So OneDrive, I think these reports are more valuable to show that we have a ongoing usage of SharePoint and OneDrive. So we kind of see this. Hopefully we continuously see data being added, or at least it's a very small rise, right? So as I talk about data cleanup, that we might be able to get to a point and kind of a nice way would be, you might have this large spike and then we kind of shallow it out as you start to govern it. And even at certain points drop down after deletion periods. So this will be more of an overall total indicator, but again, not actionable for this information. The last one is on the per site collection. So from a UI perspective, you can look per site as a site owner. This site looks the same as it did in SharePoint 2013 for sure. The storage metrics page. So it's kind of hidden behind the scenes. I'll show you how to get to that in a second, but you can look per site collection in back behind it to see the metrics of the site, to see which folders are taking up that full space. You can see this obviously in the top right. One thing I like to highlight is in the top right there, you have a very small quota for your site collection as well, to see what as a site owner, you could actually view how much storage you're taking up on your site. Now, managing it, okay? So I have a tenant, I have a total amount of data available. I now have ways to see this data available, but how can I manage it? So when I'm managing my file storage, there's two ways to do it. One is automatic, which is where I always start with organizations, which is SharePoint will automatically manage usage for you across sites. So every site collection is going to default to the biggest one, and then you don't need to worry about, let's say, certain sites filling up. What will happen is you do need to be aware of your overall, it's more on your overall quota. You'll be having to monitor that. We don't need to monitor that per site. If you want to monitor per site, you can set the tenant to manual. So what you can do is then you can say, I want to control storage in my organization. I don't want every site to be 25 terabytes. I want to put, maybe it's not the governance that I want to have, or there are specific sites that I want to be large but monitor other ones. You can switch to manual and start to do a per site quota. So I could say every site I'm going to put at 1 terabyte, notify it at 90%, and make it a ServiceNow request or an ITSM request to increase the storage of my site. An option, but really a governance question that you need to answer depending on where you're at from a usage perspective. If you do move to manual, you get to change this per site. So when you're setting this, you get to see, you could set it 25 terabytes. Obviously, if you're going manual, you wouldn't do that. You'll knock down the maximum storage to this by gigabyte, and then you'll pick the percentage. And the percentage will give you notifications to the site owners. So site owners will be able to say, hey, I know I'm at 90%. Please follow this process to request more. Here are multi-geo. This is a unique one for multi-geo that all geolocations, they do share your pool. So if let's say I had 4 satellite locations, those are all going to be part, and I had 2 terabytes. Those 2 terabytes are all going to be part of those 4 satellite locations, all part of your 2 terabytes. Now what you can do is you can manage storage quota per geolocation. So if you want to make sure you don't have, in this example, North America, you don't want North America to take over all of your storage, you can start to govern some storage quotas by your geolocations to ensure that you don't have sprawl, or just another governance action that you can put in play, because this one is a little bit harder to monitor, right? Like you don't know, you'd have to report on this. There's no UI that say, find me all my European sites and sort them in a specific way, and then what's their quota at. You'd have to export that and do your own manipulation through like the active sites page. Not great. So that's why you can look at this and have your own multi-geo storage settings. Now, the way I do end up going with storage management is actually through PowerShell. So our wonderful host here, Vlad, if you go back to our webinar series, there's also a wonderful blog out there now on the Sysget site all around PowerShell, and one of the key PowerShell scripts we use. This is one of them. So if you want to look at your storage information in your organization, you can use this script here, which will use the SharePoint Online module, SharePoint Online management shell, and it will run a report for you and do some of the calculations to give you a quota percentage and tell you what the overall percentage of your organization is being used. So I know, Vlad, is there anything you want to add into this one? Have you, I know this is one of the key PowerShell scripts you and I have talked about and manipulating, but what are your thoughts?
I was just going to say, and I don't know why I seem to be a bit blurry here. I think my camera needs a bit of coffee or something. But I'm happy, first of all, that you ran it in your tenant and it works. So I'm looking at the screenshot, I see it's updated. So that's definitely good that it worked. Also remember that right now the scripts, all the scripts that you get on the internet, they're a bit of starting points, right? Like you see this one is sorting by storage usage current. If you go into the manual mode of storage that Drew talked about a bit earlier, maybe you want to go by percentage used. This way you want to make sure that you might increase the storage before a business user needs to open a help desk ticket telling you like, hey, I don't have enough storage. But it's a really good starting point. There's quite a few scripts on the internet out there. And always make sure you test them in QA before you use PowerShell scripts in productions, even my script. So remember, this one is a get SPO site, right? So there's not that many things that it can break, but always test in QA before you go in production. But yeah, that's it for me. And I'm happy you worked on your tenant, Drew. When I was looking at the slides, I was like, wait, did he take my screenshot? Oh no, he actually used it. I was happy.
Oh yeah, I had to read. I don't go through the Vlad star certification for your PowerShell scripts. I don't. I'll follow your recommendation there, but absolutely. I mean, I think that is a good point that PowerShell will be the best route for you today as an administrator to manage and manipulate your organization, especially in SharePoint. As a SharePoint admin, this is a world we kind of have to live in. and it's a world I've learned to embrace, and writing some very advanced PowerShell scripts like this. If you're not familiar with it, my message is it's okay, right? Like take this, I guarantee this one will work. Follow some of the posts out there, look at some of the Pluralsight stuff that Vlad has. There's some good stuff about managing PowerShell as a SharePoint admin. So this is a good one to get started with. Now, there is something missing here though. So what if I was looking at, what if I want to have OneDrive here too? I was curious about who's actually working with OneDrive and potentially taking up that storage. So OneDrive is different, right? So I showed you, so if I ran the report, I could get everything that's in SharePoint. I could go into the tenant and I saw I had 2 terabytes. And I could set everything to automatic. That automatic is going to be, again, across your SharePoint Online site collections. OneDrive has its own storage limit. So I didn't put that in that PowerShell script, so I want to show you it'd be a different percentage, right? So OneDrive, by default, you could set this up to 5 terabytes. So 1 terabyte is where a lot of people start. You can enter this up to 5 terabytes, and that's your range that I usually sit in for OneDrive. And that will be the quota or the limit that you have for how much data you can store in each OneDrive, not in all OneDrives, it's every OneDrive. So if I have 1,000 users, you actually have 5,000 terabytes of data availability in OneDrive by default. There actually are scenarios where you can go beyond that. If you do, and you have a OneDrive that's like 4.4 terabytes, you do have a ticket option available. Microsoft lists the information about how to do it. You can make a specific request to have that OneDrive site collection be increased. And they will say, is it a file share? And you'll say, no, it's just someone who has a lot of data. So it is possible, but the big thing is this is for per OneDrive site collection, you can set the storage limit. And this will be the limit across all of your OneDrives. After that, you can go in and change it per OneDrive. So if I wanted to change the storage limit on one OneDrive site, I actually can come in and change those specifically to what I want. So if you have, let's say, frontline workers, or I've seen one where we have contractors and we just don't want them storing much information at all, because if they leave, that will get deleted. So you have to be careful with overusing OneDrive in some ways, especially for people that are transient or coming in and out. So a good practice can be to limit that, or basically decide who should get a lot of personal file storage versus not. So you can set the overall and then come in and set more granular levels. Now, again, the PowerShell side of this, if I want to look at this, I can run this report and look at OneDrive usage against this. So I can include something called -include personal site that will run, and you'll see my storage count for my the Deadpool and Quasar accounts here are much higher compared to the rest of my OneDrive or the rest of my SharePoint sites. So you can look at everything together. I'll be careful. This is a very large one in organizations. Be careful running this one with the limit all. Better to target some of this if you needed to, but in this test environment, fine. And you'll see the quotas. My OneDrive quotas there are 5 terabytes, while my SharePoint quotas there are 25 terabytes. Another way to look at this information. The last thing in talking about scripts is there are, if you're looking at a breakdown by file size and file version, there is scripts out in the PNP script sample library. Again, as Vlad mentioned, I will read it again. Make sure you run these in a QA or test environment. But if you're looking into storage usage, there are some pre-built ones in the PNP. We have some in on the syskit page, and there are some out in different Git repos. So especially ones in Git repos, be careful for. But I like pointing this one out as there are some storage options here, and they are going to continue to grow. So let's take a look at storage management, though. So I'm going to start with start in the SharePoint Admin Center, and I'm going to start on the active sites page. So you're going to see once I'm here and I'm on the SharePoint Admin Center page, it's all up, just up in this top right page. That's literally where we see our storage quota. And what I'd like to see is we now have here under the All Sites tab, we have a largest sites view itself. So we don't need to necessarily go in and create our own custom views. We can come in and use the largest site view to start to manage and look at what's happening in my organization. What I've normally seen is you'll have, this is obviously a smaller percentage, but you'll have a few sites that take up the majority of the percentage in your organization. That's where you're going to start to look at concentrating on cleanup. But the main thing to look at here is going to be this storage used tab. Now you might say, great, this tells me what my storage is on this here. What about on the site itself? So I'm like, great, here's GPU solution accelerators. Now if I go into a site, the way to check what's on that actual site is going to be up in the gear, the top right. And if I go into the gear, we're going to go into site information. You'd think it might be site usage, right? You might think it'd be site usage. That's just activity on the site. That's not actually storage. It won't tell you what's being filled up. It will be the usage of the site, the people, the activity. So if I go into site information, we're going to go into view all site settings right there. And when I go into view all site settings, there's going to be a section, as long as you are an owner of the site or a site collection admin, there's a stored metrics section. This stores metrics. So these is all at the site collection level. That's where you'd be managing this. You're in a sub-site world. I still recommend coming. You can see this per sub-site, but you'll be looking at it from that sub-site world if you do it there. If not, here is what it looks like at a site collection level. So you're going to see I have barely used anything on this site collection, but if I could drill in, you'll see my main information is in a library called documents, a folder called syntax, and actually a library called retention labels. So in very large sites, you'll see a very obvious mark of what's taking up the most information on your site. And that's the way to kind of drill from highest level. I have 2 terabytes. What's my largest site? Go into a site and see what information is actually on that site. On the percentage side, that's up on the home tab. So if I'm in SharePoint Admin Center and I go to home, you can come in here and I'll scroll down, as I said, you almost always have to. You'll see SharePoint site usage. So this will be the card that you can use to go view your nice little graph. That will probably look something like this. And hopefully we can make it look more something like this as you go. To manage this is actually, to manage your quotas, it's all going to be under settings in SharePoint Admin Center. So in settings, you're going to have those 2 sections we're going to be looking at. First, you're going to have, for SharePoint, you have site storage limits. This simply goes in, and this is where you set manual or automatic. Not a lot to it, right? I get 2 different options. By default, everything starts in automatic. You need to go move it to manual if you want. If I went to manual, you can set your default, but then you're going to be going back in per site on the active sites page to go change and modify the storage available per each site collection. OneDrive is under the OneDrive storage limit. So under OneDrive storage limit, if I go in here, you can see that's that same screen I had where I can set the default storage limit for all of my OneDrives. If I needed to, I could go in per user and change the OneDrive settings for that as well. The last reporting section to look at is going to be in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, not the SharePoint Admin Center. Now you can link to it. So if I'm in the Admin Center and I go home and I look at, well, I go to reports, I can go, home here, I go to usage, like right here, default report. These will take us back to the admin portal themselves. So these links aren't actually hosted here. This data, these inactive sites, the sites most files, these all point back to my overall admin center under the usage section here. Under usage, we have our SharePoint and OneDrive storage locations. So for governance, you're probably managing SharePoint. For more awareness, you're watching OneDrive. So it's like I'm checking my overall quota, and I'm checking to see how much people are actually using the stuff. So if I'm in the SharePoint side, what you're going to be looking at is usage, not activity. So activity is different. Isn't it fun that site usage here actually shows a different language than site usage on the site collection? So site usage here comes in and we'll have a storage page here, storage card here basically that lets me take this report, look at what's out on these sites, and give us a view of how much storage is used in our organization. And down here, you also have a different way to look at this information. One of the reasons this is separate versus like going to the admin center is permissions, right? So people can look at the admin reports here or look at the reporting in general without having to be a SharePoint admin. While going to the SharePoint admin center, you get to look at, that gives you your specific rights to go view that information there. So there is a reason why they're separated and not sitting in the admin center. Because of that, to me, it's a big reason to who has access to what. And last thing I want to show is this PowerShell does work. So I'm going to run in my environment here, I'm going to run one for getting all of the last one I ran to include OneDrive. So I can take this PowerShell script and I can run it. And what it's doing is I'm going to grab all sites. So get this PO site says get all my sites. Well, get sites, get all sites. And I'm going to select some specific information here and generate an expression for it. And that's going to run. It's going to give me a list of all of my sites. And imagine this isn't one you want to run with like 57,000 sites or a large amount, but you can break this out into a more batched area to bring this through if you needed to, like a filter on like the size here. So all of this, you could take this, I could report on it, it's a starting point to get what I need. As Vlad mentioned, take this information, run with it. What do I actually want? What do I want to achieve? What am I trying to find? Am I looking for just top usage? Am I looking at maybe saving this and trying to build a trend over time? Viable, but it's really kind of, here's a tool in the toolkit to have you grow. So great, that's a lot of, it's a lot. So I want to talk, I got a few minutes to talk about optimization. So I'm going to go in and first thing I want to touch on is the different levels of optimization that we have. So the first thing we have in optimization, I'm thinking of what can we do today? So the first thing I'm going to look at is archiving. We can utilize Microsoft 365 Archive for a good cost. We can look at trimming versions, and we can look at deleting large sites or teams. Those are going to be like the three key pillars I'm looking at for initial optimization. And the first thing I'm looking at is Microsoft 365 Archive, which is a better storage cost for us if you have sites that are no longer used. So Microsoft 365 Archive will give us the ability for, as sites, if we don't need them anymore, it's a cheaper storage place for them. This cost will occur only when you go over your actual quota. So the cost for archiving your data is cheaper than buying your SharePoint storage for the 20 cents. That's where it comes into play. The advantage in here versus like deletion is you do have compliance capabilities. So I can do e-discovery, I can do DLP, and what actually happens is it just disables the site. So a very good option to decide if I have a large amount of sites, I can come in and I'm really close to the quota, I can archive them, which then will, as I go over the quota, the cost will be much cheaper going forward. And actually, I'm going to come back. I'll come back to it if I need to. I want to talk about the versioning here. So outside of archiving, let's say I've looked at it of archiving information. Versioning can go wild. So every time you have a version, it's going to build new copies of those files. Not full copies, but a large amount of data. So here's a file I took that we've been working on recently. Every file is 4.5 megs, 5 megs, 5 megs. Imagine if you had a 10 meg or 100 meg Excel file. This can grow exponentially. There is a PNP report that you can use to go gather this information to see where I have like version sprawl. But what Bruno will show in a little bit, there's also some great third-party tools like Cisket here to look at some of the version sprawl that we have in play. And your most basic one is deletion. So if people get scared of deleting, don't be that scared of deletion. You can manually go look at large sites. My best advice here is just sort by large sites, export that, and then sort by access or activity. It's basically our own site lifecycle. You can do this every quarter, every 6 months, have some way to come in and say what's no longer valid. And I always look at the largest sites for no activity and say that usually can be a massive hit if I get to get like 20 gigs back for one site or 20 terabytes back from one site. Something like that is usually your main big cleanup option. So I like seeing archive, versioning, and just manual deletion. All of those give us some very key information or very easy scenarios to purge all this information. Now, cool, I deleted versions. I've enabled archiving. I have went and deleted 20 terabyte site collection. What else can I do going forward? There are three things I think about for ongoing. One is automatic expiration. So you don't have to do this manual cleanup. You can do automatic expiration. You can also deploy retention. So how am I going to, if you're scared of deletion, identify content that needs to be retained and then delete after that. Or if you're ready for, if you're going to go have an expiration deletion process, great. Identify what you want to retain first. That can give you a long-term plan. So as sites delete or remove, you will only keep what you actually need. And the last one here is set up meeting recording expiration. So if you are worried, as Copilot is continuing to grow, we are seeing meeting recordings continue to build. I'll show you how to do those, these three things here. This is my opinion, but great way of ongoing. So the first one, group expiration. So group expiration is not new, but it is specific to, it will expire groups, which will expire the team and specifically the SharePoint site around it. So if I'm using modern team sites or Microsoft Teams, you do have the ability to expire groups, which will then enforce the user to go, say if there's been no activity, they can either renew it or it will be soft deleted. So kind of self-clean, right? We want to optimize this cleanup action. Group expiration will only work for inactive groups. It's based on activity of the team on the site. Active groups will continuously renew. So if a team or group site isn't touched, that is when it will start to rotate and into the expiration timeline to expire based on your lifetime. So 180 days, 90 days, 365 days, pick the timeline, you'll hit that and start to expire. You put an email for ownerless, and if you do have retention, that will always win. So if it's not going to go delete a team if I have a retention policy. That's not how it works. This is a good tool to manage your groups. Now, the challenge I have with this one is if you're using groups in like Outlook, or if you're using groups across the board, like not just in Teams, which you probably are, you have the risk of expiring like Outlook-based groups, which could be for mail only. So you need to be careful if you do all. You can be limited here. It's hard. It's very hard to scope these though. You can only put manual selected ones in here. So it's a good tool. I like having it specifically for a set of groups you have, but you have to have a governance process to add them back in if you're not going to do all. Inside of, if you're not want to do group expiration, you can also do inactive sites. So this is a new solution in SharePoint Premium as part of the SAM licensing, the SharePoint Advanced Management. So inactive sites actually allow you to set SharePoint in the SharePoint Admin Center expiration or inactive policies, basically expiration for sites that are not only M365 groups. So you're able to take these, I could take just classic sites, I could take other sites that are not GroupX, and I can set expiration based on those, following a very, very similar inactivity, right? So if people aren't working in Teams, if they're not working in Engage, if they're not working on the site itself will follow the site lifecycle policy and use this in the SharePoint Admin Center versus group expiration. So in my opinion, you have a lot more power here because you can do a lot of filtering. So you can filter by the source, I can exclude specific sites, more granular control for inactivity versus the group expiration. There are things that are auto excluded, right? So this isn't going to do stuff with retention. It won't work with OneDrive. The gap here versus group expiration is ownerless. So if I have an ownerless team, it won't work in the inactive policy. It will only work in the group expiration policy. That's where I see the overlap here, but technically I love this example, but it does come with the premium cost. So yeah, sorry, it does come with a premium cost. Next thing is going to be part of the retention. So data lifecycle management is in the Purview suite. This is going to be the built-in module where you can build retention policies or labels to retain information or retain and delete information. And the way to think about why retention is important for ongoing is you get to only keep what you need. You don't need to keep everything, keep what you need, and then that will start to lower your digital hoarders, which will then in turn lower your storage usage. You can provide this position, so I can auto delete. I could say I want someone to go approve it before that. Just beware of over retaining, okay? So you might think it's a good idea to put a retention policy on these all SharePoint sites for 1 year, be aware of that preservation hold library and what that is. You might actually go the other direction and store too much stuff versus actually lowering it. So retention is valuable for cleanup, as long as you have the policies in place that actually do the cleanup and not simply retaining everything forever. So what you do here is you have a plan. Retention's a lot more, like we could do days workshops on retention itself, but in general, the feedback is you figure out what works for you, and this is a slower process. You can't just go turn on retention today. It will actually go delete stuff that you don't want. And the last one here is Teams meeting expiration. So we'll be looking at, in the Teams admin center, you can set a checkbox there that says automatically expire. The default expiration is out there. It's really up to your organization. I've seen organizations push this out. It does move this to the recycle bin, so it doesn't just like delete the recordings. They're available for recovery if you needed to, but you don't have a lot of leeway. You just kind of turn it on and it just goes. Again, default's 120, but I have seen people more pushing that out. That's the beware. Like, don't have someone come in and say, "Oh, let's keep this stuff for 3 years to make sure I have it." That's not the case. That actually will start to balloon it. The risk is leave it at the default or be aware of the impact by increasing that expiration time beyond what was originally stated. If you do change it, it only affects new meetings. And if you are retaining meetings, retention again always wins. So if I'm saying on the SharePoint sites that have retention, that's fine, right? It's not going to delete those. Don't be worried about these deleting meetings if you have retention policies out there. And because if you are worried, I mean, technically users can still actually delete this stuff today. So if there's retention, they can't delete it fully, but they absolutely, it's a file sitting in a folder that users have control over. This will simply expedite the process if they haven't. So I skipped over some of those demos, I know, because I went long and talking about the general statement. I wanted to make sure I have time for questions and the demo here. I'll leave you with, it is up to you as an administrator to optimize your storage. There's a lot of data here. This will not do it for you. You can't just turn on your tenant and just let it go. It is up to you to manage and optimize it across this entire workload. So if a takeaway is, think about those 3 scenarios for governance at the beginning, or for cleanup at the beginning. Think about those 3 for ongoing. And I want to pass it to Bruno here with time to talk about how SysKit can do some of that for you as well.
Thank you so much, Drew, for the awesome presentation. You got a lot of content in there in 50 minutes, and I'm sure you could spend another hour talking about it if you had it. But everyone, we already have 4 or 5 amazing questions here in the chat. So let's give Drew a little break, and Bruno will show us how we can easily manage storage with SysKit. Bruno, are you ready?
Yep.
Awesome.
I'm ready. Thank you, Vlad, for the introduction, and thank you, Drew, for a great presentation. So I will take a couple of minutes to present Point, our governance and security platform for M365 collaboration tools. So let me just switch over to Point. As you can see from this dashboard screen, in Point, we can dive into a lot of different areas of the tenant to both gain visibility of our inventory and manage it directly with various actions. But in keeping with today's theme, we're going to focus on storage management. Now, from the on-premise days of receiving low disk space alerts to now dealing with storage in SharePoint Online, I've yet to meet someone who was excited to go to work and having to deal with those. But it's a topic that's increasingly more difficult to ignore because, well, it keeps on growing, and more importantly, it keeps on incurring more and more costs. When it comes to dealing with this issue, as with most things, the first step is to be able to identify the issue on time so that you can act on it. While natively you can set up storage quota alerts, one of the challenges we've identified is that these are sent out to global administrators. And while GA accounts are usually separate from their owner's main account, they don't have a mailbox license attached most of the time. This means that those alerts aren't actually reaching anybody. So for this, we've created multiple ways in Point to bring this to your attention. First, let's go off into settings into our policy and configure our tenant storage limit policy. Here we can define the threshold at which the policy will be activated, and more importantly, choose who the recipients of these alerts will be. So users with real mailboxes that will actually know they need to act upon this. Once this is configured along with an email, this will also create a policy violation in our security and compliance checks dashboard. But even before that happens, here on the storage tile, we'll be able to track a lot of useful information about our storage. We can see the total consumption. If the limit is breached, we'll receive a warning like this one. And probably most interestingly, we'll be able to easily see how much space we could potentially save and how much we already saved. Now, for most organizations, storage trends over time will grow rather than shrink. However, there are still ways to control that growth, slow it down, and keep it in check for as long as possible. Most of you will simply have some amount of files in the tenant that will always be there, even after deleting obsolete files or obsolete sites, duplicate instances of the same file. You'll reach a point where you simply cannot remove it any further. However, the amount of storage those, let's call them essential files, are consuming can still get way out of hand. And as we've heard, one of the main offenders here is the file versioning. Now, it's a feature of online collaboration activities that can save you in some cases, but also cost you a lot at the same time. Tackling this, again, brings us back to visibility. If we take a look at the largest sites view here, we can easily identify which sites are largest, how close they are to their quota, when was the last activity on them, and what were their storage trends over the last 7 or up to 180 days. This could potentially give you a clue of any anomalies if those numbers are going up or down in unexpected ways. Now, to prevent sites from hitting their storage limits and hindering users from their day-to-day operations, we can simply increase the storage here and make sure that site owners are notified, perhaps a bit earlier, to prevent any further disruptions. But naturally, the idea is not to keep adding on storage, but to actually save some. Now, with the default settings of file versions that are set to 500, you can reduce them, but not below 100. And the most challenging thing is that it won't actually delete existing file versions. It will only limit new files from going over that number. In Point, you have two ways of trimming files. One is by selecting a number of versions you'd like to keep, and the second is deleting versions that are older than some time period. You can easily configure both, and as you can see, you can go well below the 100 limitation here. Now, clicking on the potential savings, I can filter out sites that will show me those with most savings potential. From here, I can simply bulk select them and clean them up as I see fit, even going to the last, all but the last file version. But as not all sites are created equal, we might need to be more careful in our selection here. For this, we can use additional attributes like the sensitivity labels or any number of custom metadata tags we can assign to sites like the department here. And perhaps HR has different versioning needs than, let's say, marketing. So I can simply select marketing here, now bulk select those, and be much more confident that I'm cleaning only the content that needs to be cleaned. We can also go into details of a site. And here we'll see some of the familiar graphs, but also we can filter our files by various types. Here we see that Office files are taking up most of the space. And if we take a look at the file list here below, we'll see an all too common scenario. A small PowerPoint presentation that, because of unchecked versions, is taking up a lot more space than it should. And I'm sure most of you will find much bigger offenders in your tenant as well. Here we can go even down to each individual versions and delete them how we see fit. While admins are never expected to go into such level of detail, it's important to know that this tool is not only for them. It will also empower your content owners to log in, gain visibility, and control of the sites and files they own, not just by reducing the space they're consuming, but also ensuring their content is secured and not overshared. And with this, I'll bring a close to this demo, but as this was only a small fraction of Point's capabilities, if you'd like to explore other features and see how much potentially you could save in your own tenant, I invite you to sign up for a free trial available on our website. And now I'm going to bring it back to Vlad for some Q&As.
Thank you so much, Bruno, but don't go too far yet, okay? We'll get Drew back because there's some questions for you too. So we'll wait for Drew to get back here. Drew, I know we're near the top of the hour, so you're going to have to go soon, so I'll start with you. Can we get storage quotas, or can we set, storage quotas or limits for individual users in SharePoint Online and OneDrive?
So we can, nothing from a store, that's a great, yeah, I wish. No, I totally wish. So the closest thing you can do is from OneDrive. Everything from a storage perspective, all quota management is at the container. That's the way I think about it is you manage the container, not access to the container. So there is no way to say these sites get, every time Vlad creates a site, his sites are 1 terabyte versus every time Bruno creates a site, his sites are 10 terabytes. Like there's no, it wouldn't, you might be able to, if you built your own custom provisioning process, sure, but not technically, right? There's no built-in solution to say, I can manage that per user. OneDrive, you can go and change a OneDrive quota, but nothing is user driven, it's only container driven.
Awesome, thank you so much, Drew. A question for you, Bruno, now. So the question is storage more expensive in SharePoint than in Azure? And then second part of the question, is there a tool to move data from SharePoint to Azure Cold Storage? Does Qiskit do that?
So at the moment, Qiskit does not do that, but will most likely align with Microsoft archiving process once that goes out of public preview. But we're kind of still in a wait and see scenario until that is finalized to invest our own development efforts, potentially even see if there are some, again, things we can improve upon.
Awesome. Drew, anything you want to add? I know you mentioned M365 Archive a little bit. It's still in public preview. Any quick comments you want to add about M365 Archive, first impressions, things like that?
So going to Azure Cold Storage is fine in some scenarios, but you lose all compliance. That's where I've been killed, is retention, e-discovery. E-discovery is the big one. If you're retaining something and you run an e-discovery search, you have to come out, find a way to go search that, and it sucks. There's no good, you have to buy another tool. So Archive has been a gap here in general. It is going to be, since it's still in preview, I haven't seen like what true costing will look like, right? I can tell you what the cost model is, but you pay for hydration. So you retain for storage and you pay for bringing it out of Archive. So there is going to be, what will be curious is when that threshold's hit, right? How much data am I keeping, and how often does it have to actually come out of archiving? So don't think of it as like, I'm gonna archive per week, unarchive it, archive per week, unarchive it. No, this is like I wanna keep something available for e-discovery for maybe 3 to 6 months, maybe project close plus 6 months, and then remove. Like, it is not a long-term backup solution, but the native side of it is so much better than trying to move to Azure Cold Storage. Azure Cold Storage is fine, or Azure Blob Storage is fine, but it is not reporting at anywhere.
Awesome. Drew, one last question for you. So does Microsoft give a separate or additional storage for meeting recordings or videos like they did before when we had Stream and we had that separate starting storage?
We don't anymore. And that was one of the painful transitions when I've worked with a large customer who had a ton of Stream in Stream Classic now, then moving it over to SharePoint. All videos now are files. It's just an MP4 file, or whatever the codec is. Like, it's just a file sitting in SharePoint, and that's the way they're treated. So storage-wise, usage-wise, sharing-wise, you get the benefits all of SharePoint as a collaboration tool, but you have the cons of some of the things like Bruno highlighted of just general storage. So if you're doing it hasn't hit as much recently because the migration occurred for Stream Classic, but you do not have videos are videos, just like a video is just like a large Excel file, right? I mean, it's just a file.
Very large Excel file. Awesome. This is it, Drew. Once again, thank you all for joining us on today's webinar. As mentioned, everyone that registered for this event will receive a recording of the webinar. Drew, thanks again for sharing your knowledge today and for showing us everything we can do in Microsoft 365. We really learned a lot. Anything else you want to share before we wrap up?
If you need to get a hold of me, I didn't put contact information, either LinkedIn or Twitter. LinkedIn is probably the best one for this, so look up Drew Madelung on LinkedIn. I'll gladly respond to any questions outside of that. If not, Twitter. And if you really have a deep question, contact Vlad on Syskit. He knows how to get a hold of me from my email. So with that, I got to run, guys. So thanks for this.
Thank you so much, Drew. And for everyone else, if you've seen Bruno's amazing demo and you have any follow-up questions, you would like to see a more in-depth demo, make sure you reach out to sales@syskit.com. And if not, you can always just go to the Syskit website, start a 21-day free trial on your own environment. This way you can actually get to experience Syskit Point on your own environment, because honestly, that's the most fun way to just get it set up and use it. So it was a pleasure having you all here. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here, and see you next time.
Bye.